In 1979, the world watched as a revolution in Iran overthrew a king, humiliated a superpower, and reshaped the Middle East. But this moment didn't begin with religion. It began with oil and a British plan that went too far. For decades, Iran had been one of the West's closest allies. So, how exactly did a modernizing monarchy turn into an Islamic republic that still calls America its enemy to this day? To understand, we have to rewind to a time when Britain owned Iran's oil and refused to let it go. For most of the 20th century, Iran's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. Beneath its deserts lay one of the richest oil reserves on Earth, but since the early 1900s, that oil had been controlled not by Iranians, but by Britain through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, known today as BP. Through this organization, the government owned a majority stake in Iran's oil industry. It powered the Royal Navy, funded Britain's economy, and left Iran with barely a fraction of the profits. The contract that made this possible was signed decades earlier under a monarchy that relied heavily on British advisors. By the 1940s, most Iranians saw it for what it was, a symbol of subservience. In the southern oil city of Abadan, British employees lived in air-conditioned houses with running water, schools, and clinics, while Iranian workers lived in shantytowns beside them. The contrast wasn't subtle, it was humiliation made visible. Every train that carried oil to the ports reminded Iranians that their wealth was leaving with it. When World War II ended, so did Iran's patience. Across the country, new political movements rose calling for national sovereignty, not just in words, but in control over resources. Out of this wave came Mohammad Mossadegh, a charismatic lawyer and nationalist who had spent his life studying how empires disguised domination as diplomacy. He believed that until Iran owned its oil, it didn't truly own its future. In 1951, Mossadegh was elected prime minister and immediately nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. To his supporters, it was a declaration of independence. To Britain, it was theft. London called the act illegal and demanded compensation. Mossadegh refused. He argued that no foreign contract could claim eternal rights over a nation's wealth. His speeches drew crowds of thousands, many in tears, shouting his name as if he had restored a stolen inheritance. For the first time in living memory, Iranians felt that their destiny was their own. In London, that same moment felt like the beginning of the empire's unraveling. If Iran could nationalize its oil, other colonies might follow. Britain responded with economic warfare. The Royal Navy blockaded Iranian ports, freezing oil exports. Technicians and engineers were withdrawn from Abadan, leaving refineries to fail. The British government froze Iranian assets and launched a global boycott to stop other nations from buying Iranian oil. The pressure was immense. Revenues collapsed, unemployment surged, and Mossadegh's opponents began calling for compromise. But he refused. He took his case to the International Court of Justice, insisting that sovereignty was not something to be negotiated. In 1952, the court ruled in Iran's favor, declaring that Britain had no legal claim to interfere. For Mossadegh, it was a moment of triumph. For Britain, humiliation. And in humiliation, empires always find justification. MI6, Britain's foreign intelligence service, began drafting plans to remove Mossadegh and restore a government that would cooperate. But post-war Britain lacked the strength to carry out a full operation alone, so it turned to its ally across the Atlantic. In Washington, a new administration under Dwight Eisenhower was preparing to confront the Soviet Union wherever communism threatened to spread. British officials seized the opportunity, framing Iran's crisis not as an economic dispute, but as a looming red threat. They claimed Mossadegh's weakened economy might push him toward Moscow. It wasn't true, but it didn't have to be. Ultimately, the United States agreed to act. Together, they launched Operation Ajax, a joint CIA and MI6 plan to remove Mossadegh and reassert control over Iran. It would become the blueprint for covert regime change during the Cold War. The mission's logic was simple: create the illusion of chaos and then offer the Shah, the young monarch in exile, a path to restore order. The operation began quietly. CIA agents funneled money to Tehran newspapers to print fabricated stories portraying Mossadegh as corrupt and mentally unstable. Religious leaders were bribed to denounce him in sermons. Politicians were paid to abandon him in parliament. British operatives distributed leaflets claiming he was plotting to abolish the monarchy. When persuasion failed, they turned to the streets. Agents hired men from Tehran's slums to pose as rival protesters, some carrying pro-Mossadegh banners, others loyal to the Shah. They clashed violently, drawing the army into the chaos. Tanks were deployed, and generals, some secretly paid by the CIA, turned against the government. On August 19, 1953, the coup reached its climax. Crowds filled Tehran, burning government buildings and chanting for the Shah's return. At his residence, Mossadegh surrendered to soldiers who had once pledged loyalty to him. He was tried for treason and sentenced to house arrest for life. In London and Washington, officials celebrated. Newspapers described the event as a popular uprising. Photographs of cheering crowds filled the front pages, evidence that the Iranian people had rejected extremism and restored sanity. Behind those headlines was a quieter truth. The entire uprising had been funded, organized, and directed from abroad. For Britain, it was the perfect resolution. The Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was restructured into a new consortium that still favored Western firms. Iran received a slightly higher share of profits, but decisions remained out of its hands. For the United States, it was a triumph, a new ally secured, another communist threat eliminated. But in Iran, that stability looked very different. What Washington saw as victory, Iranians experienced as betrayal. Every Iranian who had marched for Mossadegh's vision understood what had really happened. A democracy had been dismantled by the very nations that preached it. Britain got its oil back, America gained influence, and Iran lost its faith in both. Meanwhile, the Shah launched sweeping modernization projects meant to prove that monarchy and modernity could coexist. Schools and highways were built, industries expanded, and women gained the right to vote. Western journalists called him a visionary reformer, but the new prosperity wasn't shared equally. Land reforms displaced small farmers, new factories favored the elite, and urban growth left millions in poverty. Iran looked prosperous in photographs, yet the gap between ruler and ruled widened with every project announced in his name. To secure his throne, the Shah created SAVAK, a secret police force trained with American and British help. Its agents monitored universities, censored newspapers, and interrogated anyone suspected of disloyalty. Whispers of torture spread through homes and mosques. Citizens learned to lower their voices when they spoke of politics. The Shah's modernization was real, but it rested on fear. As the Shah's ties with Western powers grew stronger, so did the feeling that Iran's future was being decided somewhere else. American technicians advised the military, foreign investors ran oil contracts, and Western diplomats praised the Shah as a reliable partner. But each gesture of support reminded Iranians who had really placed him on the throne. By the early 1970s, Iran's economy exploded again as oil prices soared. The new wealth turned Tehran into a city of skyscrapers and neon lights, while villages on its outskirts struggled to afford bread. The Shah celebrated the boom with extravagance that blurred into absurdity. In 1971, he hosted a festival at Persepolis to mark 2,500 years of monarchy, erecting a tent city in the desert, and importing chefs from Paris to serve caviar beneath crystal chandeliers. The festival was supposed to honor Iran's ancient glory, but instead, it highlighted how distant the Shah had become from his people. Among the exiles watching from abroad was Ruhollah Khomeini, a cleric who had been forced out of Iran years earlier for criticizing the Shah's dependence on the West. His sermons, recorded on cassette tapes and smuggled back into the country, spoke in simple terms. He warned that even though the Shah sat on the throne, foreign nations still pulled the strings. Every agreement and every foreign presence was a reminder that Mossadegh's vision hadn't survived, and that Iran's sovereignty now rested in foreign hands. By 1978, protests were spreading from mosques to factories and universities. When protests broke out in the holy city of Qom, security forces opened fire, and the funerals that followed sparked even larger rallies. 40 days later, crowds returned to the streets to honor those who had been killed. In Shia tradition, people hold ceremonies 40 days after someone's death, a ritual of mourning, not protest. But in Iran, each of these gatherings grew into new demonstrations, and each one led to more bloodshed. Without anyone planning it, the country slipped into a 40-day rhythm of grief and anger that the government couldn't control. The Shah declared martial law, soldiers opened fire, and the violence spread. Within a year, even his generals doubted he could survive. In January 1979, the Shah fled Iran, officially for medical treatment. His departure ended more than 2 millennia of monarchy. When Khomeini returned from exile 2 weeks later, millions of Iranians filled the streets to greet him. Western embassies watched from behind locked gates as the revolution they hadn't predicted swept through the capital. The Islamic Republic that followed was born from the feeling that Iran had been robbed of its future. Khomeini rarely spoke Mossadegh's name, but people hadn't forgotten him, the leader who once tried to make Iran truly independent. Khomeini wanted his revolution to stand on faith, not politics, yet it was Mossadegh's dream of sovereignty that gave it meaning. To many Iranians, 1979 wasn't about starting something new, it was about taking their country back. That November, a group of students stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran and took 52 hostages. For them, it wasn't an act of chaos, it was revenge for years of interference, a message to the same powers that had overthrown their democracy in 1953. From then on, every conflict between Iran and the West carried that same history. Every attempt by foreign powers to guide or control the region only made it more defiant. The coup that once seemed like a victory for the West ended up changing how the entire Middle East viewed power and trust. In Iran's textbooks, the 1953 coup isn't treated as just another Cold War story. It's remembered as the moment trust was broken, when outside promises of freedom turned out to be lies. Even today, when Western leaders talk about bringing democracy to the region, Iranians remember what happened the last time they heard those words. The irony is clear. Britain and the United States destroyed a democracy to protect their own interests. And by doing so, they set the stage for one of the century's biggest revolutions. They kept their access to oil, but lost the trust of an entire region. What began as a plan to protect Western interests reshaped an entire region. The coup that once seemed like a victory became the starting point for decades of distrust. Even after the empires left, their influence stayed, in borders, in governments, and in memory.